want to have an opportunity for you to know who she is as far in advance as possible, so you know what she's going to be talking about and know how to spot her. Anybody with a red ribbon on, as Eustace has, is a speaker. They're a fair target for free lunches and dinners. And Dietrich Ludwig says amen to that. I know you'd like to talk to them some more, and that's an opportunity where you can get them isolated a little bit, one-on-one, and that's where you can learn an awful lot in the break time. We've talked about the subject of freedom a little bit, and we need to talk about it a lot. We could talk about it for several days and have speakers on that subject. But we try to bring in some of that to alert you as to what you might be able to do, what you ought to know, or what can be done, or what kind of message you can take back with you when you go home. There are still people moving around in the exhibit area, and I'm going to ask them all to either be seated or go outside to where they want to talk. No talking in the exhibit area, please. We want to be able to have it quiet enough. This PA system is less than what we would like, and we appreciate your cooperation in being as quiet as possible so it will work, at least as well as we can make it work. And we do appreciate our electronics people trying to make it go. Since these things are built into the hotel, we don't have a whole lot of control over it. We do the best we can. Are you having trouble with the tape thing?
No, tape's ready.
Oh, okay. We're ready? You're ready. Okay. From Staunton, Virginia, Eustace Mullins has been researching the problem that exists in our governmental situation for 40 years or more. He has written several books, including Secrets of the Federal Reserve, including A Writ for Martyrs, and Murder by Injection, one of his later books, and The Rape of Justice. They all contain enormous amounts of research. I wonder how any one person could do this much research in one lifetime. If you read those books, you will find that out. That reminds me. Somebody shut me off. That reminds me, and he didn't tell me this because he's too much of a gentleman to do this, but somebody else knows this. Several of his books disappeared while he was absent from his table last night, 5 or 7 or so books, and we would appreciate those people coming and paying him for those books. We know that you intend to do that. It was an oversight on someone's part. If you have done that, please see him. And he didn't ask me to make this announcement, but we know that he is not a rich man, or I don't believe he is, and I don't think that anybody really knowingly wants to do that. They probably took him for examination and forgot about it. Anyway, welcome, Eustace Mullins. You're going to be enriched by what you hear.
Thank you. It's always a joyful experience to be with a large group of people who are on the same quest on which I've spent my life, and that is the quest for knowledge, the quest for liberty, and the quest for more information. The biggest lie of our educational system is that only children can learn and only adults can perform. And of course, you and I know that we learn all of our lives and that your education does not stop when you get out of the government institutions. I come from a long line of country preachers, so I may get a little inspirational from time to time, but you'll have to bear with me. I first came to Denver in 1943 to the Lowry Air Force Base, and in the war years, Denver was really a fun town, but when I come here ever since then, I've always been on business, and I really haven't made the rounds or enjoyed the city the way I did in those first months. I come from a little town in Virginia, which is in the mountains, and to show you how you're always in the middle of things, even though you have no idea of it. I grew up in that little town, and from my bedroom window, I could see 3 historic buildings. Right below me was a building which was designed by Thomas Jefferson. for Alexander Stewart called the Stewart House, which is occupied today by a political hack Supreme Court judge, and he and I do not visit back and forth very much, or ever. Then from my other window on this side, I look out and I see another historic house. These are all on the National Register of Historic Places. And that house is called Sears House, and the area is called Sears Hill. Well, I grew up all those years without knowing that Sears Hill was named after General Barnabas Sears, who had come there after the Civil War. And Barnabas Sears was the Southern representative of the first of the major charitable foundations, which was called the Peabody Fund. Now, the function of the Peabody Fund was to help control the political life of the southern states. We did have the military occupation government in the southern states from 1865 to 1877. And during that carpetbagger period, we also had General Sears there with the Peabody fortune, which was used as the political funding of anyone who wanted to go into political life. So you had this, not only a martial law, military occupation, you also had a representative of the Rothschilds, and without that money, no Southerner could run for political office in the southern states. And the Peabody Fund, probably you would know it better today as the Rockefeller Foundation, because it later went through a change and became the Rockefeller Foundation. And the Peabody Fund was named after a Rothschild representative named George Peabody in London. And you probably don't know the name of Peabody, but you would know the name of J.P. Morgan, because George Peabody had no heirs, and so he chose a fellow Bostonian to come to London and take over his firm, and that man was Junius Peabody, and his son was J.P. Morgan, who changed the name to J.P. Morgan Company in 1895. On a recent trip to Georgia, I spoke in Atlanta, and I said, I'm going to do something I've wanted to do for many years. I'm going over to Jekyll Island, Georgia, which is one of the most historic places in the United States. It's historic because at a secret meeting there in November 1910, the representatives of the leading bankers met in a secret meeting, and they drafted what became known as the Federal Reserve Act. Now, the Federal Reserve Act and the Federal Reserve System, which it spawned, has a misleading, if not false, name. The Federal Reserve System is not federal. It has no reserves except your pocketbooks, and it is not a system. It is a criminal syndicate. And because it is a criminal syndicate, they had to have a criminal conspiratorial meeting to set it up. So I went over to Jekyll Island. I didn't even know if the building was still standing. It was written in the Jekyll Island Club. And it was so conspiratorial that the participants would not address each other by their last names. They called each other Henry and Nelson and so forth, and Paul. And the Nelson was Nelson Aldrich, who was the Republican Majority Leader of the Senate. And his daughter married John D. Rockefeller. And today in Williamsburg, Virginia, we have a historic museum which is called the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Museum of Folk Art, which is one of the great collections of early folk art in the United States. So I went over to Jekyll Island, and in the good old days, the members of the Jekyll Island Club arrived by yacht. There was no bridge to the island at that time. Well, I didn't have a yacht, and so I thought I would go by train, but there was no longer a train going to Jekyll Island. I found out that I could take a bus over there, and I went by bus. But even though I didn't arrive in as grand a style, after I got there, they did not have a room, and all they had was a suite. And so for the same price, I got the J.P. Morgan suite. And J.P. Morgan, unlike some of his fellow conspirators, did not build a home on Jekyll Island. He preferred to stay at the club. And so here I was in this quite beautiful room where J.P. Morgan had been some 60 or 80 years ago. But the J.P. Morgan company was not one of the major financial families of the world, even though he was advertised and publicized for many years as the world's leading banker, the world's leading capitalist. I found in my researches over the years that there are, in the world order, a three-tier hierarchical system of families. The first families are the Rothschilds, the Schiffs, the Warburgs, and the old black nobility. And the second tier are their underlings, people like Averill Harriman, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller. Yes, the Rockefellers are not first tier, they're second tier. And then on the third tier, you had the families who served the second families, and that included the Bush family, because the Bush family was involved in Brown Brothers Harriman, which was the Harriman family banking house. And George Bush was named after his grandfather, George Herbert Walker, who was president of W.A. Harriman Company in 1929, and which became later Brown Brothers Harriman. Now, a friend said to me recently, he said, well, you go all around the country publicizing George Bush. Why doesn't George Bush give you a retainer? Because I do. I tell people as I go travel around, I tell them the real family history of George Bush. One of the things which George Herbert Walker did, well, he did endow the Walker Cup, which is the most prestigious award in golf, but he also was a director of a firm called American International Corporation, which was set up in 1915 in New York to take over a burden which Jacob Schiff of Kuhn Loeb Company, the Rothschild firm in New York, had maintained for many years. Jacob Schiff had spent $20 million of his personal fortune to promote Bolshevik propaganda in Russia and to overthrow the Tsar of Russia. So by 1915, Jacob Schiff was tired of spending all of his money. He didn't spend it all, but he had spent $20 million. So he suggested to his fellow financiers that they help him in order to subsidize the effort to change the government of Russia and replace it with a communist government. So they agreed, and he had people like Percy Rockefeller, George Herbert Walker, and others to join him in setting up American International Corporation, which then began to promote the communists in Russia in a big way. And within 2 years, they succeeded and they took over the government of Russia. Now, the reason they took over the government of Russia was not that these bankers wanted to overthrow international finance. The Rothschilds wanted the Tsar's fortune, which was the largest private fortune in the world at that time. And of course, they achieved their immediate goal. They were never really interested in communism. They were interested in money and power, which they still are. And when I speak of the three tiers of families, Lenin referred to the second tier families and the third tier families as useful idiots. And that term, I think, still bears up today, because the first tier of families were the people who exercised the real power and the real influence, and the second and the third tier families, such as the Bush family, were considered by the first tier as useful idiots who would do their bidding throughout their lives, because by obeying their dictates, they themselves would be very handsomely rewarded. They would have fortune, they would have financial independence, and they would have a certain degree of political power. So as I say, George Bush was of the third tier family, and he is related distantly to the Queen of England and the black nobility, but he was chosen as head of the Central Intelligence Agency, which is the world's leading drug organization. He was chosen to head that agency simply because of his relationship to the Queen of England. Lyndon LaRouche received a great deal of ridicule because in his public statements he identified the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, as the world's chief drug dealer. Well, of course, I doubt if Queen Elizabeth has ever handled any drugs in her life, but what he was referring to was her symbolic position as the head of the British Royal House. And the British Royal House made their initial money in dealing in slaves. And then by the dawn of the 19th century, there was a great deal of resentment around the world about the institution of slavery. So they more or less abandoned the slave trade and went into the drug trade. And they found out that was a lot more profitable, because when you brought a shipload of slaves from Africa for sale, by the time you delivered them to the docks, half of them would be dead because the conditions were pretty horrible. So, but when you ship drugs, opium, you really don't have any losses. If you pack them well, and you don't have any seawater damage, you're not going to lose any of your cargo. So the British royal family and the black nobility made a lot more money out of the drug trade, and of course they've been promoting drugs ever since. And the reason that Bush became head of the CIA was that because the drug trade was run from London and Hong Kong through the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, the Central Intelligence Agency, as I point out in my book, The World Order, was set up during the Second World War as the Office of Strategic Services. It was set up as an intelligence agency, which was simply a branch of the British Secret Intelligence Service. Now, the British Secret Intelligence Service had been set up by the Bank of England after it was chartered in 1694. It was the oldest and the most effective secret service in the world, and it remains that today. So when Bush was named head of the CIA, he was simply receiving an honor which was due him, due to the fact that he was a member of this family. And of course, as head of the CIA, he was the symbolic drug leader of the world. So when he became president, then he had to launch a crusade against drugs. Well, unfortunately, the crusade against drugs has turned into a crusade against the civil liberties of every American citizen, because now they have all this stop and search, and they have the tax restrictions and the restrictions on handling any sum over $10,000, and they want to get rid of the $100 bills. All of these are designed to increase the amount of government intervention in your private life. And of course, this is done by the politicians, because they themselves are the useful idiots in Washington who simply carry out the orders of their superiors. No one could be elected to political office in the United States who was truly an independent thinker or an independent actor. Well, when I say actor, you probably think of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan got the best role of his life. After being in Hollywood for many years, he was finally given the best character portrayal he could ever do, and that was to be President of the United States. And he had enjoyed it immensely, and he never fluffed a line during his entire political career in Washington. And he really did a great job. And of course, George Bush does not have those attributes. He doesn't have the show business background, but he does have what is even better. He has the family relationship with the black nobility. So he too can do no wrong in the eyes of the world order. And the drug trade, as you notice, gets bigger every day, and the government appropriates more and more money to control it. And the only result is that your taxes go up and your civil liberties are increased. Now, when I said that there were 3 houses visible from my bedroom window, and I mentioned the Stewart House and the Sears House, there's a 3rd house which is also visible from my window, and that is the birthplace of President Woodrow Wilson, who was born in Stanton, Virginia. And Wilson, of course, signed the Federal Reserve Act into law on December the 23rd, 1913. It was done very hastily. The New York Times commented that it was an unprecedented act of legislation to be rushed through in such rapid order. And the reason they had to rush it through was the Western congressmen who had opposed it vigorously for many months in Congress, such as Congressman Charles Augustus Lindbergh, who said this bill will set up the most gigantic trust on earth, and that future generations will regret what has been done here today. Well, of course, Lindbergh's words were prophetic, and they were true. And for saying those words, he lost his seat in Congress. He was threatened with being tarred and feathered in his home state, even though he was a congressman. His books were burned. And in fact, a young agent of the Bureau of Investigation, as it was known then, this young agent went with the team to Lindbergh's home to burn his books. And when young Charles Lindbergh rushed out to protect his father's property, he was knocked down by this young agent whose name happened to be J. Edgar Hoover. So J. Edgar Hoover had an early start in carrying out the dictates of the world order, and Lindbergh was one of his first victims. Many years later, J. Edgar Hoover called in his 4 top agents, the assistant directors of the FBI, and of course I had been writing and speaking at that time, and he gave them orders that I was to be committed to a mental institution. Well, this wasn't as easy as they thought, because I had no mental problems, and I'd never even talked to a psychiatrist in my life. So anyway, these 4 agents were sent out word to the Chicago special agent, where I was living at that time, that he must go to a county judge and he must get permission or agreement that when they brought me in, he would commit me to a mental institution. So they went to my apartment, and they were to pick me up and bring me in. And by providence, and often in situations this time I seem to have been protected in some way, I had left several days earlier to go to a cottage owned by Russell Kirk in Michigan, Lake Mecosta, and I was going to write my final draft of a biography of Ezra Pound. So when the agents came and I wasn't there, and they had to report back to J. Edgar Hoover that I was no longer at home, so they then sent out all of their informants to find out where I was. Well, I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I really lived like a hunted man for about 30 years, because I had to keep my movements somewhat secret, and I had to be very careful about who I confided in. So of course I had told no one I was going to Lake Mecosta. They reported back to Hoover that I was not available and that they couldn't arrest me. And so of course then he sent out a national alert for me, a nationwide alert at all train stations, all bus stations, and all airports. And of course, I was driving around in a little old car that I'd bought for $100. So all of these efforts were in vain. But I didn't find out about any of this for a number of years until I got my FBI file. And then I found out that when Hoover could not locate me, he decided I had been tipped off by someone in the FBI. He knew that I had a close friend in the FBI. And he decided, being a very paranoid person, he decided I was on my way to Washington to kill him, which had never entered my mind. I was more interested in Ezra Pound than I was in J. Edgar Hoover. So he stayed under very heavy guard for about a week until they finally located me up in Lake Mecosta. And then, because he believed I had been tipped off, he finally abandoned the whole program, and I knew nothing about this for almost 30 years when a friend in Chicago kept urging me. He said, "Why don't you apply to the FBI and try to get your file?" I said, "Well, how could I have a file?" I said, "I've never belonged to any subversive organization. I've never been arrested in my life. What would they have?" So at his urging, I finally wrote to the FBI and I said I would like my file. So they wrote back and they said, "Well, we have 800 pages. And so I immediately ordered it, and they ignored that. First they said I had to send them an affidavit that I really was Eustace Mullins. And since I'd been under daily surveillance by the FBI for 33 years, there really should not have been any doubt about who I was. But I got the affidavit and sent it to them. Then they delayed some more, and this went on for about 2 years. So finally, I sent a note to a young man I'd gone to college with, who was now a senator from Virginia, John Warner. And I said, I'm having a problem getting my FBI file. Well, 2 days later, there was a knock on my front door at night. I opened the door, which I shouldn't have done. And there was a guy standing there, and he thrust a box into my hand, and he ran. And of course, it could have been a bomb, but anyway, I took it in and looked at it, and there was my FBI file. But there were only 500 pages, so I immediately protested, where are the other 300 pages? Well, they wrote back that they had had a high-level committee meeting, and they had decided that if they released this 300 pages to me, it would endanger national security. So, of course, I've always been a patriot, and I thought, well, I don't want to endanger national security. And then I thought it over some more, and I said, well, I wonder what is in there that would endanger national security. So I applied again, and they again refused me. Well, after I read the file, and I found 40 pages of memoranda concerning this conspiracy to have me put in a mental institution. So I had been filing lawsuits for a number of years. I had not met George Gordon, or I'd have filed a lot more, and because he really tells you how to do it. And the first few times I had gone into court, I had no idea what was going on. I also had no idea that the courts are actually a satanic operation, and that you go into demonic presences whenever you go into an American court. So anyway, in my innocence, I had no idea of any of this, but I learned it over the years. So I filed for $35 million for damages because of this conspiracy on the part of the government agents and their totally illegal acts. Because in the file itself, there were letters from the special agent in charge in which he warned Washington that the FBI had absolutely no authority to have anyone committed to a mental institution. Well, that didn't bother them at all. J. Edgar Hoover never bothered about things like that because he was one of the leading Masons in the United States, and the Masons were used to getting their own way. And so he went full scale ahead. So I went before a federal judge, and of course, they claimed that the service was not correct, and he dismissed it, which was not true. So I refiled immediately then for $50 million because all of the work of rewriting of the lawsuit and filing it again, I figured that's at least $15 million more. So meanwhile, I had a default judgment on the $35 million because they had not answered in time. They later claimed the service was faulty, which it was not. So then on the $50 million, they again did not answer on time, so I entered the default judgment with the federal court, with the clerk of the court, for the $50 million. So I now had $85 million on deposit at the federal government court. Because once you file a default judgment, you file it without notice to the parties. You do not go before the judge. You simply take it up before the clerk, and she has to enter it. This is the federal rules of civil procedure. And I was always a great one for following the federal rules of civil procedure. In fact, I got my own set of the U.S. Code, which is the most fascinating reading that you can ever get into. You can find anything you want in the U.S. Code. If you just dig into it, you can find the backing for whatever legal maneuver you want to take. So I did nothing about the $85 million for several years. Then I met Dr. Edwin Vieira, a very fine lawyer in Orlando last year, and I said, what about this $85 million in default judgments that I've got? He said, well, it's perfectly good. He said, you can go and collect it at any time, and if I can ever get back to Stanton and settle down for a couple of days and do the legal work, I'll go and collect my $85 million. But it's really more fun traveling around and meeting with you people than it is to go and get that money. But of course, in traveling around, as I say, I was reluctant to tell people where I was going and so forth. So this is criticized by psychiatrists as a paranoid condition. Excessive fear. In fact, yesterday morning, when I opened the door of my room here, I found that someone had taken a wood chisel or something and had been gouging away at the door at the safety lock on the top of the door. And apparently had made a very serious attempt to try to get in. And So I looked around and no one else's door had this on it. So then I thought, well, maybe they weren't trying to get in. Maybe it was just a mark of Herod, which was a note to whoever went by to kill the person who's staying in this room. Because when you are paranoid, you do think about these things. So as there was a lady in Dallas who wrote a very lengthy article about me a couple of years ago, and she could not grasp any of the things that I had written about, so she, after citing some of my passages from the world order and everything, she finally dismissed it all as showing that I was paranoid. But she did not know my personal definition of a paranoid person. A paranoid, according to Mullins, is an American who hasn't been murdered yet. And also, I was walking through a cemetery one day and I saw a tombstone, and the tombstone said on it, "I told you somebody was following me." So this is paranoia, and I have to admit that I'm guilty of it. Now, I've written books about the legal profession and about the medical profession and about the banking industry, and of course everything comes back to the money power and the great influence that they're able to bear on every avenue of your life. And I got into all of the research because I had met a political prisoner in 1948 named Ezra Pound, who was being held without trial in an insane asylum. And in fact, I think that J. Edgar Hoover's impetus for going after me in 1959 and having me placed in a mental institution was that I had secured the release of Ezra Pound in 1958. And I had done this by bringing someone in who had a good friend who was a Congressman Usher Burdick of North Dakota. And he went to Usher Burdick, who owed him a lot of political favors because this man's father had gotten him elected. And so Usher Burdick went on the floor of Congress and he said, "I don't understand why this man is being held for 13 years without trial," which was he was sort of our Count of Monte Cristo, the man in the iron mask. So after Burdick broke the story, then they decided to go ahead and release him. But it caused some resentment in the establishment that I had brought this about. So as soon as they released Ezra Pound, that's when I think J. Edgar Hoover decided that, well, they now had one less mental patient and they had to bring those rolls back up, so they would have to have me put in his place. And that was probably the impetus of the entire thing. So anyway, the fact that I did not fall for this, I didn't stand still for it, and this is what I tell people everywhere. You've got to fight every inch of the way because the political system is so corrupt, and it's corrupt because it's dominated by the money system, which is even more corrupt. And this goes back 5,000 years. Now, when they say there's nothing new under the sun, you think, well, there's a lot going on, and we've had a lot of technological improvements, and we're going to have a lot more. But the fact is, very little has changed in 5,000 years, and I finally went to the Bible and began to read it in the light of what I had learned over the years in my researches. And I found right there in Genesis the curse of Canaan. And the curse of Canaan goes right back to the cult of Baal and the early demonic influences in civilization, which have been persistent over the past 5,000 years. And their techniques have not changed very much. But when I read Genesis and it said that the curse of Canaan was placed upon Canaan because he had seen his father's nakedness, and I knew that this meant some sort of sexual thing, but I didn't know exactly what it was. And I met a lady, a very fine biblical scholar, in Atlanta a couple of years later, and she said, this was a euphemism for the fact that Ham, the father of Canaan, had intercourse with Noah's second wife, who was a demonic personage named Naamah. And Ham had intercourse with Naamah, and the result of this was Canaan. And because Canaan came from this tainted origin, a curse was pronounced on him, and in Genesis it was disguised under this accusation that he had had. Well, the evil and demonic activities of the world, I found finally, after years of research, I found the will of Canaan. And the will of Canaan, when he died, he charged his sons. He said, love one another, love robbery, love lewdness, hate your masters, and do not speak the truth. Well, when I read that, it was quite a revelation because the will of Canaan described the personal philosophy of every politician in Washington. And I knew for the first time who they were. They were Canaanites. And also from Canaan came, Canaan's grandson was Nimrod, who was a demonic personage who became the dictator of the world as the emperor of Babylon. And his activities were so outrageous. They involved lechery and ritual murder of children. And because of this, Shem, another son of Noah, the righteous one, Shem killed Nimrod and cut his body up into little pieces and sent these pieces to the priests of Nimrod, his priesthood, to warn them to cease and desist from their activities. Well, the priests did not do so, and in fact, they took the pieces of Nimrod and they hid them in groves in the woods, which were called shrines. And from these shrines developed what was known as Freemasonry and Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism simply means the knowing ones, and what the knowing ones knew was they knew where the bodies were buried. You know, you've heard all your life about someone who knows where the body is buried. That means a person who is on the inside, who knows all of the secrets of the conspirators and the demonic elements for the past 5,000 years have been passed on down to him, and he becomes one of the knowing ones. And the people who know nothing of this, of course, who are totally in the dark, have no idea what these people are up to. And when I started going into courts, I had no idea that I was going before a Masonic presence, and that the lawyers and the judges were equally involved in this situation. So it was not until I began to do the research for my book on the legal profession, and of course the way I do my research is I not only go to books, I go through all of the periodicals. I get the Reader's Guide to the Periodical Index, and this lists all of the articles which are available over the past 50 or 75 years. And I found in there an article in the Columbia Law Review of June 1935 by a Dr. Felix Cohen. And Dr. Felix Cohen had written in this article, and he himself was the dean of the law school at Columbia University, so there was no better authority on the legal system than Dr. Cohen. Dr. Cohen said, due process of law means nothing in the light of recent judicial decisions, and it is a metaphysical cover-up phrase. Legal concepts, for example, corporations are supernatural entities which do not have a verifiable existence except to the eyes of faith. Rules of law, which refer to these legal concepts, are not descriptions of empirical social facts, but are rather theorems of an individual system. Jurisprudence is a special branch of the science of transcendental nonsense. Now here is a legal authority telling you that the judicial system is transcendental nonsense. Well, in my researches, I found out why Dr. Felix Cohen had written that, because I found out that the judicial system itself is a Kabbalistic temple in which the ancient Kabbalah dictates the rules of evidence, it dictates the legal procedure, it dictates legal precedents, and when you understand that, then you can understand what you're up against when you go into an American court of law. Now, after I had begun to learn a little bit of this, I found in my possessions, I used to go to auctions for a hobby and pick up all sorts of things. And the biggest industry, or the biggest employer in my hometown of Stanton, Virginia, is the local insane asylum. In fact, when you go anywhere in Virginia and you say, oh, I'm from Stanton, they usually tap their head, you know, because they figure they know who you are. And, and when the people are brought into this asylum, you know, they're in pretty bad condition, and so they take away everything they have. They take away their jewelry and their money, and they put it away, and sometimes they divide it up among themselves, and sometimes they keep it in case you ever recover. So over the period of 60 or 100 years, they had accumulated some jewelry and so forth. So they had an auction, and I went to this auction, and I bought 5 rings for about $25, and one of these rings was a Masonic ring. So after I found out that the courts were Masonic, and I was brought into court on a charge, and so I walked confidently up to the judge's stand, and I put my hand right in front of him with my Masonic ring. Well, it had absolutely no effect. So you say, in fact, like most of my ploys, they don't work. I have to say that. And this was, whenever I have some lightning bolt of inspiration, and I say, boy, I finally found out how to win, and I go in there, and the same result. They throw me out. So the judge looked at my Masonic ring, which was right in front of him, and it didn't have any effect. He pronounced me guilty anyway, and he fined me. It was a traffic charge, and he fined me $15. Well, as it so happened, I had previously, before this hearing on the traffic charge, because it was an unjust charge, I had filed suit against the mayor and the chief of police for $500,000. So even though I had to pay the $15, I kept them in court for 3 years and on this charge, and it was finally dismissed, but their legal fees were $22,000. So I felt that maybe I came out a little bit ahead on that one. And so my nephew was helping me in my books, to haul my books and so forth over the past year or so. And because he was working with me, the police got orders, and they began to harass him, and they stopped him about 40 times over the period of about 10 months. So I got tired of this, and I went to his mother, and I said, you know, he really has grounds for a lawsuit. In fact, I told her this after they'd stopped him about the 3rd time. And I said, he really has grounds for a lawsuit. They've stopped him without a warrant. They've stopped him without due process. They've stopped him without notifying his parents. And this did affect his schoolwork, and he really began to have some adverse results. So after the 40th time, his mother agreed, and I drew up a lawsuit, which she signed as attorney pro se, against the chief of police and the mayor for violation of civil rights and affecting his schoolwork and quite a lot of stuff. I had 6 pages, and of course, in my rape of justice, I held it below 600 pages, but because I had filed so many legal things over the years, it could have been 1,500 pages as easily. So I have sort of a library of all these lawsuits I've filed, and so I went back to my lawsuit against the mayor and chief of police, and I brought out the whole thing, including the Nuremberg Trials, because now you might think, what do the Nuremberg Trials have to do with the traffic charge in Virginia? Well, if you have a legal mind, you have no problem in making the connection whatsoever. And I do have a legal mind, and so I brought in the Nuremberg Trials. And because, you see, there's a great body of law which is called the law of agency, master and servant. And whenever I file one of these suits against the chief of police, he immediately files a motion to dismiss on the grounds that he has absolutely no responsibility for the actions of any man on his force who is on duty. And this is an interesting concept, that all these policemen running out there, running around and stopping people, are totally irresponsible, and that there's no way in the world that they can be held, that the chief can be held liable for their actions. So of course, I got out my files, and I found in there on the law of agency that I had about 20 or 30 citations going back to Queen Elizabeth and going back to Sir Edward Coke on the law of agency. So I cited all of these, but in deference to a lot of opposition that I've gotten in courts in recent years, I had begun to load up, being a scholar, I had begun to load up my pleadings with a lot of long paragraphs in Latin and Old English and various languages, most of which I couldn't read myself, but it sounded good, and it looked good, and it really made my pleadings look very scholarly. So the lawyers got tired of this, and they went before the judge, and they got an order from the judge to keep me from using foreign languages, particularly Latin, in my pleadings. Well, the interesting thing about that was the language of law for many years was Latin. So here you had these lawyers, some of them making $300,000 or $400,000 a year, saying we can't read Latin and we don't want Eustace Mullins to continue to file all of these pleadings in Latin. Because I believe that since Dr. Cohen says it's all a lot of mumbo jumbo and transcendental nonsense, I think all the pleadings should be conducted in Latin to begin with. Because no one knows what's going on anyway, and this would make it more obvious. And in fact, I must say that the light went on. Every once in a while, a light goes on, and I begin to see what's really going on. And I was in Chicago back in the early 50s when they had the Chicago 7 on trial as communists, Abbey Hoffman and a bunch of nuts up there. And so I followed this trial, and I noticed that what the defendants were doing, they were not trying to defend themselves. When they went to court, they turned it into a circus. And I began to realize then that the courts were simply a charade anyway, and that the proper thing to do is to go in and make a circus out of it. But you can't be offensive about it. You don't want to offend the judge because he has the contempt power. So whenever I went to court, I would make a production out of it. You have a table before the judge. The plaintiff has a table, and the defendant has a table. And they're big tables. So the first time I went to court, I'm sitting there with my little notebook, and I thought, this is kind of silly. I got this huge table. So from then on, I began to bring in 2 or 3 tape recorders. I bring in all of my published books and line them up with bookends. And I'm sitting there. You build yourself a little fortress in the courtroom. And so the opposing attorneys would be sitting over there with just a few briefs or something. And here I'm sitting behind all this array of books and tape recorders, which I didn't even know how to turn on, by the way. I'm not very mechanical. And the only time I did use a tape recorder, the tapes didn't work. So I never, in all of my legal proceedings, I never got a tape which I could use. I have to confess to that. So I would go home and I think I've got everything recorded and I can go over it and pick out their errors. And when I put the tape on, all I could get was a lot of noise. So I had to start over from scratch, which wasn't too bad because, as I say, it was a charade anyway. But I have had a lot of fun in court, and as George Gordon says, if you're not having fun in court, you should not be there. And when you do some research and you find out it's a lot of Kabbalistic mumbo-jumbo, Fred Rodell, who was the head of the law school at Yale, called the legal profession, he called it high-class voodoo and a chromium-plated racket. So you see, if the very top people in the legal profession, if that's their attitude, then you don't need to be any more respectful of all this than they are, because they're talking from the inside. They know exactly what it is. And the greatest benefit of all of my legal activities was when these lawyers would come into court, and of course I was just absolute nothing to them. They could walk all over me. And so they would say the most outrageous things about me to the judge. So after they did this a couple of times, I got to thinking about it, and I thought, well, I don't have to put up with this. So I filed suit against the lawyers under the state codes. This is all covered in the statutes that they cannot defame you to the judge. And I had witnesses for this. So, of course, they immediately filed a demurrer, insufficient cause of action, which they always do. I've never filed a suit which was not immediately responded to by a demurrer and by a motion to dismiss. And of course, you immediately have to deny that or you're out of business. So I found that the motion to deny, defendant's motion to dismiss, is one of the most interesting things that you can have in legal work, because you can throw everything in there. And in fact, the first time I did that, I threw in about 15 pages of single-spaced quotations from Ezra Pound's poetry and so forth. Confucius is very good in legal proceedings. You always want to cite Confucius. And then, of course, I threw in my Latin tags and all these other things. And in fact, I have hoped for years, and the rape of justice started out as this, that I would publish all of my briefs as the Encyclopedia of Law. And because you can get anything out of there that you want, and there's no copyright on it, anybody can use it. And the more you file, the harder it is on the lawyers to answer all this. In fact, when I had I was notified of a tax deficiency, not a tax deficiency. I was called in for a tax audit a few years ago. And I got this letter, and I opened it up, and it said, you are to appear for a tax audit at the Internal Revenue Service. And I read that, and I thought, this is very upsetting. And then the more I looked at it, I said, this is not only upsetting, I'm terrified. So because I was terrified, I sued the agent for $350,000 for terrorism. And this is what you must always do, because you have to remember the law is logical. So if you're terrified, you go to court and say, I'm terrified. That's what I did. And no one had ever done this. I don't know why, because everybody who gets a notice of tax audit is terrified, but no one had ever done this before, so they didn't know just what to do. And so we went into court, and I filed 38 motions over the next 3 months, 5 of them to halt the collection of income taxes in the entire United States until we addressed some of these legal problems which I had brought up. Because I did this because I'm an unselfish person, and I thought, why should they be collecting taxes for everybody else when the complaint that I have registered with the court applies to every taxpayer in the United States? So let's stop collecting all these taxes until we decide these things. Well, they didn't see it that way. And so finally, they dismissed this action against me. And as soon as they dismissed it, then the IRS came right back at me with a notice of tax deficiency because they had disallowed all of my deductions. And so I went right into tax court. Now, many people in the conservative movement will tell you, never go into tax court because you're not going to get a fair hearing. Well, as Jerry Spence, who's probably the best known lawyer in the United States, says in his latest book, Justice for None, you're not going to get a fair hearing in any court in the United States anyway, so don't single out the tax court as a special. It's no worse than the other courts. And so I went into tax court, and you really have to prepare before you have any kind of court proceeding. Preparation is the key. You can't go into court and be arguing your case and suddenly remember, gosh, if I had looked up something that applies to this, I could probably knock them dead with it, but you know, you can't go back and do that once you're actually in the court. So I had filed some stipulations and motions with the tax court. Some of them were quite inventive, and one of them was that the IRS was equally guilty with the FBI in conspiring to have me placed in a mental institution. And in fact, I had a few letters in my FBI file which sort of gave that impression, but there again, you have to stretch things a little. There was no real direct connection. So I filed this with the tax court. So when I got down to Richmond, and they had a very stern-looking tax court judge. I took one look at him, and I said, "Oh, I'm dead." And so anyway, the bailiff called out Mullins versus respondent to Commissioner of Internal Revenue. And so I stood up and I said, Your Honor, and I always like to use that phrase, Your Honor, without making it sound too satirical. And that is a little bit of acting on my part, because I try to draw it out. Sometimes I say, Yana, and make it sound like an old Hebrew phrase or something. But I've never been challenged on it. So anyway, I said, Yana, I have this stipulation before the court. So the judge immediately responded. He said, now, Mr. Mullins, we have no time to go into any of that. Now, this is the same judicial system which can spend 2 or 3 years they could spend $40 million trying to find out how much Colonel Oliver North actually paid for 2 tires. But they had no time for any of my inquiries. So the Internal Revenue Service had not even sent anybody to this hearing, believe it or not. Instead, they sent a young district attorney from the Department of Justice. So the judge said, now, Mr. Mullins, I want you and this attorney to go into this room, and I want you all to thresh this thing out between you. And I thought, well, my gosh, I have nothing to thresh out. They've already disallowed all of my deficiencies, so my deductions. So we went into this little room, and the guy turned out to be a fairly pleasant young man, and he brought up various things, and we substantiated some of them, and some of them we didn't, but the overall amount was much more than they were claiming for me. I have to tell you that all of these years of frenetic legal activity and going to I even went to appellate court when they threw it out of the district court, and it's all involved about $300. So, because, you know, as they say, it's the principle, not the amount of money. And, well, I didn't have the $300 anyway, so I had a real problem there. I had to fight. Nearly all of my legal activities have come about because of necessity. I began to appear as my own lawyer because I had no money to hire a lawyer, which was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me, because the minute you hire a lawyer, you're really in the soup. And in fact, after many years of studying the legal profession and practicing law, I decided that the old legal saw that he who represents himself in court has a fool for a client. I had to bring that up to date in the light of my own experience, and I now say, he who hires a lawyer is a fool. So, at any rate, the judge in the tax court had said we would thrash this out, so we did. We went back, and the judge said, have you gentlemen come to some decision? And we responded, yes, we have. And he said, well, what is the decision? And the attorney told him that, well, they decided I did not have any tax deficiency. So before I left the court, I had a letter stating I had no tax deficiency. I had appeared in court and represented myself, and I'd gotten this. If I'd had a lawyer, I would have probably had to pay through the nose. And this was in 1982, and I have never heard from the IRS since. And in fact, I said to a friend the other day, I said, why don't they call? The reason I said this, I've developed a whole set of new things to use in court. And I'm chafing at the bit, and I want to get back into court, but they never call. So I'm telling you all this because whatever legal problems you may have, there is a workable solution, but as I say, you have to use creativity, you have to use your imagination, because what you will find when you go into court is that these Masonic lawyers and judges have absolutely no imagination. And therefore, whatever you bring in, first they're mystified by it, then they're probably upset by it, and then they may be a little angry about it, but you are in the driver's seat because you keep filing papers and motions, anything that you want to bring in there, because they have to accept whatever you bring in and file when you represent yourself. Now, Art Buchwald the humorist, had an experience with creative bookkeeping when he wrote a script which was pirated by somebody in Hollywood, and they produced a movie. and they made $250 million. And he said, where is my cut? And they said, well, we didn't have any profit. I mean, you know, you bring in $250 million and they squirreled it away and they claimed they didn't have any profit. So Buchwald hired a lawyer and he got a decision, and he said that he found out that even though they say that when you represent yourself you have a fool for a lawyer, he said he found out it's a hell of a lot cheaper. So you might bear that in mind, and I certainly have enjoyed talking to you all today. And do we have any question time, Dean? No question. All right. Well, I'm sorry, because I like to have question and answer periods because they're a lot of fun. But,
are you open for lunch and dinner?